Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first part of the Consumer-Owned Utility Speaker Series presented by Maine Youth for Climate Justice, Maine Youth Power, Sunrise Franklin County, and Maine Youth Action. My name is Elise. I'm one of MYCJ's interim co-directors, and I'll be facilitating tonight's call. Before we get going, I'd like to highlight our community agreements. At MYCJ, we center climate justice, youth voices, collective action and growth, collaboration, and a just process. We'll be joined today by Lucy Hockschartner. She's the Deputy Campaign Manager of the Pine Tree Power Campaign and has been since April of 2023. We'll be digging into the dirty details of the investor-owned utilities and how they relate to climate justice. You're welcome to submit any questions during the presentation, and we'll ask as many as we can during the Q&A portion of this call. So submit those questions in the chat, and Zach will be monitoring the chat and taking notes. Yeah, so with that, I'll pass it on to Lucy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lise. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. I truly could not be more excited to be here talking about the dirty details of investor-owned utilities. Is basically my favorite thing, which makes me a super nerd, but that's what I am. So here we are. As Lise said, my name is Lucy. I work with the Pine Tree Power Campaign. So we are the folks urging people to vote yes on question 3 this fall on the ballot. If you're a voter, if you're not a voter, there's still ways that you can get involved to make sure that the voters vote the right way. My background is really in youth climate organizing, and that's how I come to politics. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Climate is the issue that keeps me up at night, and that is 100% why I'm here. This election is the biggest climate election in the country this year. And I just know that I was like totally shocked when I learned how investor-owned utilities work. They just truly do not make sense. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I am going to share my screen, and hopefully folks can tell me if it is working. Do people see my screen? Yes, amazing. Okay. So investor-owned utilities. I think what was really interesting to me, I started getting involved with climate action honestly right out of college. I was pretty late to it, but I studied climate things in college and had never really thought about my power company or my utility company before. I had been really aware of things like the Green New Deal or these big policy ideas we're talking about, but didn't really think about who was implementing them, which is the utility companies. So utility companies, they're not necessarily cool, sexy things that we think about all the time, but they're super important. They are who's going to be making our transition happen or not making our transition happen to clean energy. And in the case of investor-owned utilities, they were really designed not to work for us. It's pretty wild. But I think what is helpful to start is just what is the question that we're talking about? Why are we all here today? It's going to be question 3 on the ballot. And it says, do you want to create a new power company governed by an elected board to acquire and operate existing for-profit electricity transmission and distribution facilities in Maine? Such a mouthful. What does that even mean? This is really about utilities. This question is about utilities. And utilities are just what we call any company that's providing an essential service. So we have electric utilities, we have gas utilities, if your home is heated with methane gas, that would be coming pipelines through to your house in a gas utility. Water is a utility, sewage, those are all considered utilities. Question 3 is really focusing on electric utilities. So the things that allow our lights to turn on and off. And utilities, there's a bunch of different ways to classify them. One of them is whether it is a regulated or vertically integrated utility or a deregulated utility. And to understand the difference between these two systems, it's important to understand what the different parts of the electric system are. And there's really 4 big ones. There's the generation, which is, a coal plant or a solar panel. That's how we're actually making all the electricity. Then there's the transmission, which is the big power lines that you see running down from Canada Those are for long distance transportation of electricity. Then there's distribution, which is all the little poles and wires that kind of take things from the transmission lines to your house. And then there's consumption, which is anywhere that we're using electricity. So your house, your school, an electric vehicle charger, an office building, those are all sources of consumption. So when we're talking about an electric utility, we're basically talking about the first three things: the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. With a regulated or vertically integrated utility, that is a utility that owns and is the only owner. They have a monopoly. They own all of the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. So this would be a utility like Vermont does this. Green Mountain Power has their own generation facilities and their own transmission lines and their own distribution lines. So they are a regulated or vertically integrated utility. They own all of it. What we have here in Maine is what's called a deregulated system. So our electricity utilities, which are here in Maine, are Central Maine Power and Versant Power. So if you're northern or down east, you're probably served by Versant. It used to be called Emera Maine. They get bought out sometimes by foreign corporations, as we'll discuss. And then if you're down in central, southern, a lot of mid-coast, you probably have CMP, Central Maine Power. These are both what are called deregulated utilities, which means they just own the poles and wires. So just the transmission and distribution. We're actually not talking about the power plants themselves. That's a market that we kind of like pay for that generation on the CMP bill, but it's not actually owned by CMP. It sort of just gets passed through on their bill. So what we're really focusing on with Pine Tree Power, with this question that everyone's talking about, it's all over the news, you've probably seen the ads. We're talking about the poles and wires, and we're talking about who is going to own the poles and wires. So there's different ownership models as well. You know, we talked about those two different market systems of utilities, but there's also two different ownerships systems for a utility. So CMP and Versant are both what's called an investor-owned utility. That's what we're going to spend our time focusing on today. We'll have another presentation, not by me, next week, talking about what is a consumer-owned utility. But it's helpful to just understand that there's these two different ways to own our electricity grid. On the one side, you have CMP and Versant, which are owned by private investors. So that means your grid, the poles and wires, all the things that you see around that's transporting the electricity, it's owned by corporations with shareholders. So it's actually owned by all these shareholders who are essentially giving money to the company and own a little piece of it. They're publicly traded, so you can usually look up who owns them. Generally, for electricity companies, it's large investment firms or holding funds or holding companies. They're not like I'm not owning my electricity company. Jeff Bezos, probably through some funds, owns my electricity company, but like you're also not going to see him on CMP and Versant's ownership. It's generally through all of these different holding companies and firms and funds that buy shares in these investor-owned utilities. A consumer-owned utility is the other kind. It's owned by the people it serves. And there's a couple different ways that those can be set up. They can either be a cooperative model in which it's just owned by the customers. So if you live in a place served by Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, which is kind of near where Versant is, but is a different utility, then you have a utility that's a co-op. That means if you are not a ratepayer, so if your name is not on the bill, which if you're young and you're living with your parents, it probably isn't, then you technically are not an owner of Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative. Then you have public utilities, which are owned by the government. So it's kind of owned in the collective by the people. That's like Kennebunk Light and Power. So if you live in Kennebunk, Kennebunk is a municipal utility. It's owned by the city of Kennebunk. Pine Tree Power that we're talking about is sort of a blend. It's, oh man, I don't know what I did. There we go. It's owned by the customers, but it has public elections. So for instance, if my roommate and I were both living in a house, this is the case. If we had a cooperative, she's the one who pays the utility bill, I Venmo her. She would be the only owner of that cooperative. What's different with Pine Tree Power is that because I'm a Maine voter, she's a Maine voter, we both would get to vote in the election. So it's a slightly different model, but we'll talk about that more next week. So I think what's really helpful to understanding like what investor-owned utilities are, why they're not working for the climate, why they're never going to work for the climate, they're not set up to work for the climate, is the history. My mom was a history teacher. I'm not a big history person, but this stuff is actually super interesting, which is basically electrification isn't that old. We were just starting to electrify America in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And at the very beginning, like this thing that we take for granted now, turning the lights on, like no one knew what was happening. They knew absolutely nothing. They basically just knew that everyone wanted electricity. So people were racing to figure out like Thomas Edison, like he's got a light bulb working. How do we get everyone to have light bulbs? And people just went at it. So some were expanding the grid and connecting all these homes to electricity by getting money from investors and promising that they'd give them their money back and some more, like they'd make their investors money. That's the investor-owned utility model. Some cities were like, we're actually just going to do it ourselves. Those are where the municipal ones come from. But then they started fighting over their customers. The investor-owned utilities would come in and say, actually, let's have some competition. And what that led to was a realization that utilities, the grid, it has to be a natural monopoly. They were trying to build multiple sets of poles and wires. So if you picture like your street in the early 1900s, they were like, oh, let's have 10 different sets of poles and wires and people can just choose which one they use. That makes absolutely no sense. It's really dangerous. It's really expensive. It's not working for anybody. So that means the grid is what we call a natural monopoly. It can only be owned by one person or one company or one government or the consumers. There can only be one company. The issue with monopolies is that there's then a huge motive for exploitation. That monopoly can essentially say, you have to pay $1 gazillion to use the grid. That's no good. So many people advocated, as we often do with monopolies, that they should be put in the hands of the people. They should be nonprofits. We should just remove that motive for exploitation entirely. The issue was that we're talking about the Gilded Age. This was a time of massive income inequality. And the people who owned the investor-owned utilities, who were getting rich off the investor-owned utilities, lobbied right from the beginning for their own system of regulation. So right from the get-go, they set up the system of regulation that we're dealing with now, which really was to make them look good without actually protecting consumers. So that's what we deal with now. CMP are these investor-owned, and Versant are these investor-owned utilities that are theoretically regulated, but they're not regulated that well because the system was designed by the people making all the money. So it was this captured system that they created. What they did is they made these public utility commissions. That's what it's called in Maine. Some states call it a public service commission. And those are basically like a court. And it's a court that, the utility will present a rate case, say, I want to raise rates. The PUC acts as a court with like the people on one side and the utilities shareholders on the other. The utility shareholders want to make as much money as possible. The people want as low rates as possible. The Public Utilities Commission basically just has to meet them in the middle. The problem is that across the country, this system has been set up so that the shareholders are guaranteed 8 to 12% returns on any money they put into the grid. So if they put in $100, they're getting $8 or $12 back, depending on where you are. The Public Utilities Commission can't make them have any less money than that. So the customers can't really get protected. The shareholders are getting these huge returns on an investment that's basically guaranteed. That's the kind of return I would get if I was trying to invest my money in the stock market and I'd be like, sick, I got 12% back. That's really great. What's different about a utility company is that we're always going to be paying our bills. It's virtually guaranteed. So it's more like putting the money in the bank. And certainly, I don't know if anyone here has a bank account. I do not get 8 to 12% returns on money that I put in my bank account. I wish that I did. And then the other thing is that this system has been set up so that often the only people who are considered qualified for these regulatory positions are people who have worked for the utilities themselves. And so there's a big revolving door between people who worked for the utilities and people who are regulating them. It means that it just isn't working very well. So what does that all mean for the climate? And I think the crucial piece here is it means a lot for the climate because our utilities are in charge of the grid here in Maine. We have that deregulated system. So we're talking about the poles and wires. We're not talking about the generation, sure, but all the solar we need, all the wind we need, all of the things that we need to be able to be getting us electricity, that all needs to be transported over the grid. It's crucially important that we have a grid that is working for people, that's connecting new clean energy, that's reliable as we're moving more things to be electric. That's all really in the interest of the people of Maine as we move into a future with both a need to decrease emissions and to deal with the climate impacts that are already happening. Like we need a grid that's not going to blow over in a hurricane, as we see that Maine now has because the climate crisis. So that's something that's in our interest. It's not in the shareholders of CMP and Versant's interest. They don't really care whether Maine has reliable electricity. And so CMP and Versant's only job in the current investor-owned system, their whole job is to make money for their shareholders. Their money is not to provide us with cheap power, with reliable power, with clean power, with a grid that's going to work for the climate. And so that's kind of like at base level why the investor-owned system is just not set up to meet this moment of the climate crisis. The other thing that's like very concrete is that CMP and Versant are actually owned by fossil fuel interests. So they not only aren't incentivized to be working to transition our grid to function better with clean energy, they're actually owned by corporations that are uninterested in that. So NMAX is the parent company of Versant. It's then wholly owned by the city of Calgary. So you've got Versant, NMAX, Calgary. NMAX is a utility that also owns gas utilities. So NMAX owns a lot of different utilities. And in some places, they're also working as a natural gas utility. So they're heating people's homes with gas. It's really not good for public health. It's really not good for the climate. CMP is owned by this company called Avangrid, which is then wholly owned. It's wholly owned by Avangrid, and then which is majority owned by a company in Spain called Iberdrola. That company, Avangrid, owns, again, gas utilities all over America. New York State Gas and Electric, that's owned by Avangrid. Rochester Gas and Electric, owned by Avangrid. Actually, maybe just Rochester. I think it's Connecticut Gas and Electric, but owns gas utilities all over the country. The other thing is Iberdrola, the ultimate owner of CMP, itself has shareholders who are the owners of Iberdrola because it's this traded company. It's owners on owners on owners on owners. It's hard to track. It's kind of like the little nesting dolls. So Iberdrola's biggest shareholders are the sovereign wealth funds of Norway and the government of Qatar. Both of those sovereign wealth funds exist. They're basically like kind of like savings accounts of Norway and Qatar, where they put all of the savings from their oil money. And then BlackRock Investments, which has invested in fossil fuel projects all over the world. And so CMP and Versant are frequently the biggest anti-climate lobbyists in the States. In the state of Maine, we run into them at the legislature. They're lobbying against a lot of the things that we want to be working on. It's really not a surprise to me when you look at who owns them. So they have lobbied against things like a bill to increase solar adoption, bills for energy efficiency. They killed a rooftop solar bill in 2017. They're really like beyond what they're doing in our grid, they also use their political connections and their money to stymie people like us at the legislature. Like if you went to the legislative lobby day, you probably walked by some CMP and Versant lobbyists in the halls. They have a lot more connections than we do, and they use them. CMP and Versant also just aren't up to the task of building a grid that works with renewable energy. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that investor-owned utilities are incentivized to build really big, costly projects and not really anything else. That's because they make their money on the 8 to 12% returns they're getting from the investments they put in the grid. So when they put in the money, put in $100, you get $8 to $12 back. But if you put in $200, you get double that. And if that's not a huge amount of money, suddenly, if you're talking about millions and billions of dollars, investing in the more costly option and getting double the money back sounds really great. And so utility companies often build really big projects like transmission lines, which are important. We need them for a transition. But we also need a lot more distribution lines that actually work, that are, and we need projects to be plugged into the grid. So solar and wind, really solar is a big one because it's so distributed. You can have it on rooftops everywhere. The grid, the way it's been set up now, is very centralized. We have like a big coal plant or a big gas plant, and kind of everything connects into that. With solar, you could have thousands and thousands of solar panels on thousands and thousands of roofs. And then you have to connect those all into the grid. That's a little more complicated for a utility than just plugging in one big coal plant. And so what they have to do is they have to study the connections of those projects, basically this generation piece that needs to plug into the grid. They don't own the generation, but they need to plug it in because they own the transmission and distribution. And basically the reason they study this is picture like, I don't know if anyone else has done this. I like when I'm in my kitchen, sometimes we'll turn on like the microwave and the hot water boiler and like, you know, the fridge, and suddenly I've like shorted out the circuit and I'm like, oh my gosh, everything turned off. Dumb me. That can essentially happen to the grid if you plug in too many renewable energy projects or too many gas projects. Just if you have too much electricity in the grid, it's no good. So they study this process that's called interconnection, which is like plugging in the projects to the grid. CMP and Versant have taken that as an opportunity to slow things down because it's not in their interest to be doing this complicated thing that's, oh boy, it's just going to save all our lives, but it's not going to make them any money. And so they delay that. They don't have enough staff working on these interconnections. They are charging massive amounts of money. Versant in particular has charged like up to $10,000 for people to upgrade the grid to allow a solar panel. That makes it a lot less easy for people, and particularly people of lower incomes, to be able to afford to do clean energy. That's a huge problem for our transition. The last piece is that building out things with Versant is going to be too expensive and too unreliable. We can't count on them because it's not their job to give us reliable electricity. And the really interesting thing about electricity in Maine is that most of our emissions are coming from transportation and heating. It's not really coming from electricity. And so when we're talking about transportation or heating emissions, we're talking about liquid fuels. Maine heats a lot of our homes with heating oil, and we power our cars with gasoline. Both of those are like liquid fossil fuels. We don't have great replacements for those. Like we don't have liquid solar. It doesn't exist. So what we need to do is electrify that. We need electric cars and we need heat pumps and electric heating. As we do that, to decrease these transportation and heating emissions that makes up such a huge portion of our emissions here in Maine, we're going to need a bigger grid. It is just going to need to handle more electricity so we don't short it out. The thing about doing that with CMP and Versant is they're going to do it on their terms. They're going to do it likely for, you know, richer neighborhoods first. This is not going to be happening in like a just way. This is going to be happening in whatever way is best for shareholders. So we won't get a say. We're not going to own it. And the other thing is that anytime they put money into the grid, they're going to charge us that 8 to 12% profit for their shareholders. What's different with Pine Tree Power or consumer-owned utility is you're not paying that profit for the shareholders. So at this moment where we need a huge investment in our grid to really make sure that we're able to connect all the clean energy we need, we're able to electrify all of our homes, all of our cars, we're able to have this like wonderful, clean electric society. We need that to be done cheaply so that it's done in a just way, so that people are able to afford their electricity bills and have a livable future with a climate that is not burning up. That's really hard. Here in Maine, 94,000 people this year couldn't keep up with electricity bills. They got a disconnection notice from CMP or Versant because they were behind on their bills. It's really hard for those people to trust moving to clean energy when they can't afford their electric bill now. So we really need to do a lot of work to make sure that this transition is affordable, and that's going to be more possible with Pine Tree Power. So this is really both a climate thing that we need to be increasing the amount of renewables in the grid, and also a justice thing of we need to be making sure that our utility is working for real people and the people in Maine who are struggling most to afford their electricity bills rather than the shareholders. That's never going to happen with CMP and Versant because it's not their job. So that's why I am voting yes on question 3. I'm super excited about it. If people want to volunteer or donate, we are up against a utility that 2 utilities whose parent companies have put $27 million into sinking the will of the people like you and me. So we are always getting folks involved and happy to do that, but obviously doing a lot of Q&A first as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucy. So much great information. I'm going to pass it on to Angela from Maine Youth Power to ask our first question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for that information, Lucy. That was super helpful to hear it again. I'm curious if you could talk a bit more about how Pine Tree Power is different from the first iteration of Our Power, the Our Power campaign, and why it was worth it to try again.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I'm just turning the lights on. Ironic for presentations at Power. I came back once from shooting ads for Pine Tree Power, and I literally, as I drove in, watched the lights go off in my apartment and was like, CMP knows what I've been up to. But yes, that's a great question. So this bill for Pine Tree Power to move to a consumer-owned utility, so away from the investor-owned model we just talked about, and moving to a model where like Mainers are the ones owning our electricity. It's like working for us. It's working for the climate. It's written in the bill that they have to be working for climate. That all started in 2019, which I think is what Angela is referring to, in a bill in the state legislature. It didn't pass, but it kind of had enough traction that they got a study bill. So the PUC, that regulator of the investor-owned utilities, had to hire a consultant to study this bill. They came back with a lot of really great suggestions to make the bill even better. So that's what happened in 2021. We brought forward a new bill that has a lot of really great shifts from the initial bill. One of which is that Pine Tree Power will continue to pay property taxes. That was a concern in the initial bill. It's like pretty wonky, pretty boring, but basically CMP and Versant pay towns a lot of money in property taxes. Towns were really concerned about supporting Pine Tree Power if they were, Pine Tree Power is a nonprofit. Often nonprofits don't have to pay taxes. And so they were really worried that they would lose all of this revenue for towns that do really great other things like fund our social services. So Pine Tree Power like pays property taxes. That was a shift. There were some shifts in how the board is made up. It's now this really cool combination. It's a majority elected board. So Pine Tree Power Maine voters will get to elect 7 members of the board, and it's kind of based on your Senate region. So you'll elect a person for your region. And then those 7 members appoint 6 experts to serve with them. One of the things that's really important to me is that group of people has to have expertise in climate. So this is something like the board of Iberdrola, like, I don't know who's on it. I work on this every day for like more than 8 hours a day, and I couldn't tell you who the board of Iberdrola is. They're so uninvolved and like don't really care about Maine. They don't have to have a lot of expertise in utilities. Their job is basically to make a lot of money. Like the chairman of their board makes 13 million euros a year. That's not what the Pine Tree Power Board is going to look like. And that was a really exciting shift in the bill now as well. And so then after 2021, it passed through the legislature, but was vetoed by the governor. And so then we moved to the ballot initiative process, where Our Power, this nonprofit, collected 80,000 signatures to put this on the ballot to go to Mainers. And then that got certified, we got put on the ballot, and then I moved to Maine, and now we're in this campaign phase where we have a really cool team. It's entirely youth-led. Our campaign manager is 25, I'm 25. Our organizer is like also around our age. So it's a really cool campaign and really focused on making sure that our future is as bright as possible.
Great, thank you, Lucy. That was helpful clarity, especially about the elected board. That sounds really cool.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it on to Anna now from Maine Youth Action to ask our second question.
Hello, thank you, Lucy, for such a great presentation. I was wondering what makes you, what you touched on this a little bit, but I'm kind of getting the technicalities of like how things are built and how they're managed. What makes our current grid so prone to outages? You referenced earlier having an outage when you were coming back from that ad. What makes our current grid so prone to outages, and how would a consumer-owned utility improve that?
Totally. So we can start broad, get wonky. So broadly, it's that CMP and Versant, like we talk about them doing a bad job, and they do. CMP and Versant, Maine, like under their leadership, Maine has the most frequent outages of any state in the country. They will tell you it's because we have a lot of trees. What they won't tell you is a lot of those trees are places where there are no electricity lines, like in northwestern Maine. Also, like there are places that don't have trees, but they do have hurricanes and tornadoes and lots of other issues that cause power outages. So we talk about them doing a bad job, and they do. But I think what's interesting about the investor-owned utility model is like they actually are really good at their legal job, which their legal job is to make money for their shareholders, and it's not to provide us with reliable power. So the short answer is like it's not their job to be giving us really reliable power, and that's why it doesn't happen with Pine Tree Power. It's in the language of the bill that they have to be working toward reliability. They're also going to be owned by the people of Maine who really care about having reliable power, putting the people affected in charge, versus CMP, where the people in charge are, you know, ultimately shareholders halfway across the world who don't care if our power goes out in my apartment in, you know, the middle of the summer. And so that's the kind of like broad reason. The detailed reason is that piece about them making the 8 to 12% on large capital investments. So that's things like brand new lines, new substations, anything they can like dump a whole lot of money in. And that sounds like something that would increase our reliability. But the problem, like a lot of it is caused by trees. And the things that you do to reduce outages from trees are really different than building like a new substation. The things that you do there are you trim the trees, you hire workers to do that. You do what's called hardening the lines, which is like you replace the lines with, you know, slightly more resilient wire. You can add these little discs that like connect the lines to make them stronger together. And that's just not what makes CMP and Versant money. And so they don't spend a lot of time focusing on it.
Thanks for that answer. Okay, I will pass it on to Isabel from Sunrise Movement Franklin County for our final question from the co-hosts.
Thanks, Lucy. Our question is, how will Pine Tree Power's consumer-owned utility board work? And how will this be different from investor-owned utilities boards? And who exactly will be elected to it? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I hear a lot. And I think that's helpful to know. It's been really interesting to work on this campaign since the spring and to see the impact of CMP and Versant's advertising, which I think is really important to note here, that they are running a lot of ads about kind of fear-mongering about the board right now. And they've spent a lot of money. And this really wasn't a question that I heard a whole lot until folks started seeing all these ads. So I think just a good note is that CMP and Versant have spent millions of dollars through their campaign front groups on polling about what is going to make us scared, and talking about the board and all of that is one of those things. The board of Pine Tree Power is actually just like made up of Mainers, and so it gives us control over our power. It's really a way to bring back energy democracy. And it's going to be so much more responsive than CMP and Versant. So when we talk about CMP and Versant's boards, you have the board of CMP, you have the board of Avangrid, you have the board of Iberdrola. And on the Versant side, you have the board of Versant, you have the board of NMAX, and then their shareholders are just like the City Council of Calgary. So like, I don't really know what you want to call that. But either way, all of those meetings, private, like I can't go as a customer. I would have to buy shares. It's actually an interesting tactic that some advocates use elsewhere in the country. Advocacy groups will like buy shares of utility companies because it's the only way they can even get in the meeting. So those meetings are closed. And they're actually like hugely political actors. So CMP and Versant are frequently the biggest lobbyists in the state of Maine. In this election cycle, they've already poured, or I guess in this campaign, not this election cycle specifically, but since the start of Pine Tree Power and Question 3, they've put in $27 million through their parent companies into our political system. So these are hugely political boards. We just don't get a say in what they're being political about. What's different with Pine Tree Power is that we are going to get to elect the members, and we are then going to be able to have a lot of accountability from those members. So we're electing the 7 board members through these Senate districts. Their adjacent Senate districts are like lumped together so that it's, not 35, but 7. And then those 7 members appoint 6 experts to serve with them. Those 6 experts have to have expertise in things like climate, utility law, labor, low income, the experience of like low income ratepayers. Those are all things the board has to have expertise in. So we're bringing in a lot more qualifications there. We're also bringing in the opinions and feelings of the people of Maine. So bringing in that democratic process. And then those board members will sit for 6 years. They're staggered at the start, so they'll be rotating. And that ensures that we'll be able to vote them out if we don't like what they're doing. The other thing is that Pine Tree Power is subject to freedom of access laws. So all of those board meetings will be public. So if you are interested in making sure that our utility is doing the most possible climate action, is doing the most they can to protect your future, you can go to those board meetings. That's a huge win. Having tried to influence investor-owned utilities before, not being able to know what they're doing or have a path to influence them is a huge problem. No accountability. So you'll be able to go to those board meetings, and then also they have to make them available through Freedom of Information Act requests. So if you want to know things about your utility, you'll be able to find that out. That's really different from CMP and Versant, that largely, like a lot of their spending is a black box. So they have to report their spending that's explicitly political. Things that say vote no on Question 3, for instance. What's been really interesting the past couple of weeks is both CMP and Versant have started running ads on Facebook and Instagram. They've never done that before. And they aren't explicitly political because they don't say those magic words, but they're all about the wonderful things your utility company does for you. And I have no idea how much money they're spending on them. I can't know, because it's apparently not something I deserve to know as a customer of CMP and Versant, because they're an investor-owned utility. So we'll have a lot of more accountability with Pine Tree Power.
Awesome. Thanks, Lucy. All right. Let's see, it's 6:43. Okay. I'm just looking, we got a lot of questions, so give me 1 second. Let's start with this one. This is one we received in our form that we put out to youth before the webinar. So how would a consumer-owned utility affect the surrounding ecosystem and wildlife? What do you hope to see happen? So I think this is referring to infrastructure and whether, what happens to existing infrastructure with a new owner.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Pine Tree Power will own all of the things that CMP and Versant own. So we buy them out, we replace them entirely. So that's one thing. As for new infrastructure, I think the really cool thing is that there's all of these opportunities for engagement. You're going to be able to vote on the board members. You're going to be able to go to the meetings. There's a lot more opportunities for engagement than there are with CMP and Versant. The last piece is that it's written in the bill that they have to be working toward, meeting Maine's climate goals. The other thing is that it's in their interest to be working for the people of Maine because they're owned by the people of Maine. Utilities work for their owners. And so that will be really different than the situation we have with CMP and Versant, set up to work for their shareholders.
Cool. All right. Next question is, why do politicians, for instance, Janet Mills, and institutions such as the Chamber of Commerce across a variety of political stripes, support investor-owned utilities despite their poor ratings and bad track records?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm just going to preface, I wish I could answer, but I'm not in their head. So I can't give you a certain answer. But I don't think it's super surprising to see. So the Chamber of Commerce represents big businesses. And I think what we've seen with Governor Mills is that I think she's really smart. I think I often agree with her. I think there are times that she's really stuck in supporting corporations, and CMP and Versant are big corporations in the state of Maine. And it's not really surprising to me that some of these politicians aren't siding with the people and are siding with corporations. I think we see that all throughout politics, and it is a big problem and it is really frustrating. But there are also so many groups and grassroots groups and voters and people across the political spectrum, like Republicans, centrists, Democrats, socialists, independents. I talk to everyone, and there are people of every political stripe who support Pine Tree Power for kind of the same reason, that they see the utilities as they are right now truly have the worst in the nation service. CMP and Versant are not just investor-owned utilities that are set up to be bad. They're actually the worst. We have the most frequent outages. They sent out 94,000 disconnection notices. That's 10% of their customers. They have the worst customer satisfaction of any utility in the country, worse even than PG&E in California, which had to literally confess to killing people because their transformers exploded and started all of these wildfires. A really sad situation. Mainers still hate CMP more than Californians hate PG&E. It's wild. So these are not good utilities. And so I think the people dealing with them see that.
Yeah. We have a great question here. How can youth, so folks who are in the school system or college, help educate about the bill?
That's such a great question. So if you are over 18, you can obviously vote yes on question 3. If you're under 18 or over 18, there are still so many more things and ways you can get involved. I would say if you just want to educate friends, if you go to pinetreepower.org, which I can throw in the chat, there's the website has been revamped. It's very exciting. So there's a lot of videos that are great for sharing. We're on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter. all the places. Those things can be shared on the website. If you go to learn more and go to the drop-down menu, you can actually read the full text of the initiative. So if you have friends who are like really in the nitty-gritty weeds, they can do that, or they can kind of just read the summaries on the pages. So that's a great way to educate. The other thing is I truly exist to be a nerd and talk about this all day. So I'm going to throw my email and phone in the chat. There are so many ways to get involved. You can call or text me or email me anytime, and I will help you. Like if you want to have a presentation at your school, or you have a club of people who's interested in knocking on doors or making phone calls about Pine Tree Power, would love to get you set up. And if you are just someone who is like ready to get out there and do things to make sure people are voting yes, you can go to this link that I'm going to drop in the chat and sign up for one of our canvases or phone banks. Our canvases are generally on Thursday evenings, Saturday mornings, and Sunday mornings. And we're in Portland. We're going to be in Bangor soon. We're in Lewiston. We're in Brunswick. We're in Waterville and Augusta, and soon to be in Bath. That's like knocking on doors, talking to voters about Pine Tree Power. It's super fun, truly the most fun part of my job. And then we make phone calls, which you can do like right from the comfort of your own Zoom screen every Monday and Wednesday night from 5:30 to 7:30. And all of those links to sign up are on the link I just put in the chat. And we would absolutely love to have you.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and send them to the webinars, and there's plenty of other educational panels and stuff like that Pine Tree Power is putting on. So sign up.
But these webinars are the most fun. So you should come to these ones. It's going to be next Tuesday and then the Tuesday after that. We're just keeping it rolling.
Yeah. Alrighty. I think this one was already kind of answered. Will we need to do any reconstruction of Maine's power system grid? I think we kind of went over that.
Yeah, I guess I'm not like totally certain on how that question. So we won't need to like reconstruct anything to move to Pine Tree Power. Pine Tree Power just buys out CMP and Versant completely. It's all the same infrastructure. It's really cool. The economic analysis shows that actually while acquiring the utility, we save money because it's basically like we're getting ripped off so much by CMP and Versant that owning it ourselves, we actually are saving money. So that doesn't require any new infrastructure. And I think I saw another question in the chat. It's the same workers as well. They all get to be employed by the new company. They keep their union contracts. They keep their pensions. It's all very exciting. So day to day, like poles and wires, the people working there, same thing. Pine Tree Power doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. What changes is they answer to us rather than to shareholders trying to make a lot of money off of us.
Yeah, Lucy, that was something that I was wondering, and that was going to be the last question about workers. And I see that there's some opposition within labor organizing.
Yeah, definitely. I can answer that. So it has been really unfortunate to see that some labor unions are unsupportive of Pine Tree Power. This bill is really a pro-worker bill. Workers, there's going to have one of the experts on the board has to have expertise in labor issues. This is going to be a company that has written in the bill that they have to be working toward like a positive environment for their workers as well. That's really different from CMP and Versant. CMP made $156 million in profit last year for their shareholders. They only sent out in all their salaries $142 million. So they literally made more in profit than they paid to all of their workers. And I think that's why we see the Maine State Nurses Association has endorsed Pine Tree Power. They were really clear in their endorsement. They were endorsing both for reasons of we are workers who put workers above the company, and we're here for our union brothers and sisters. And they were also really clear about this is what's needed for meeting Maine's climate goals and for meeting our public health goals. So I think that there has been union support, and that's been really exciting. As for the unions that don't support, I think it's really just been a tough situation of, change is hard. And I think sometimes we see that unions can be resistant to that change. And I would just say Messina, New York is another place that has taken over their utility. There's a really great article that kind of was a retrospective about how that happened. And they interviewed a union guy who was like dead set against it in the 80s. And he was like, I would give anything to move to Messina now because their electricity is so much better than anywhere else.
Yeah. I see one last question. This is just about the wording of the question on the ballot. So is the yes like an opposite choice, like somewhere on the ballot? So I think what they're asking is, you know how sometimes the wording is set up to trick you.
I
So
feel like the wording here is actually pretty good. So the question is like, do you want a new power company? And you are answering yes. So it's not like a double negative or anything weird. I do think there's still just a lot of education that needs to happen. Like it is confusing. Nowhere in it does it say Pine Tree Power or consumer-owned utility or CMP and Versant. So like it's a yes on question 3, but it's not like a double negative weird situation.
all right. And another question I can answer because I saw it. Pine Tree Power is running ads, right?
We are. And you can see them all. They're all also on our website. They're super fun. That was what came back and got my power shut off. Just kidding. It was the storm. But the day that we filmed them was the day that I lost my power and had no heated dinner. It was very sad. But yes, those are all on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll probably run into them at some point. But you know, we're running them. We don't have $27 million worth of them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you to Maine Youth Power, Maine Youth Action, Franklin County, Sunrise Franklin County, everyone, and Pine Tree Power, of course, everyone who attended. Yeah, we have another webinar next Tuesday at 6 p.m. and we'll be joined by Jonathan Fulford to discuss how a consumer-owned utility will intersect with climate justice. And we just want to let you know that we'll send out all the info we talked about, all the links, any information we discussed in our meeting tonight. We'll send it out in a follow-up email. And we'll send out the registration and the recording so you can go back and listen again if you want to. Yeah, so we hope to see you next week. I think that's it. Anything else?
Thanks so much, everybody, for listening to me ramble. I so appreciate you.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.